Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a really wild thought experiment. It's about a single moment in time that changed absolutely everything for almost half of humanity. A moment where the very idea of consciousness got flipped completely inside out.
So to really get our heads around this, let's start with two people living on opposite ends of existence. First, meet Sarah. She's always been, well, just Sarah. One person, one single unified mind. Until she wakes up one morning and her head is suddenly a very crowded room with 16 other people in it. And then there's Mira. For Mira, we has always been the normal way to think. She's a collective of 17 minds working together. Until she wakes up to this terrifying, deafening silence, utterly and completely alone in her own head for the very first time. The realities didn't just change, they were inverted.
And this wasn't some kind of bad dream. At exactly 3:47 a.m. for billions of people, a fundamental switch was flipped. This wasn't a gradual thing, it was instantaneous, a jarring, total reversal of identity.
So for Sarah, who had built her entire life around being just one person, this was an absolute nightmare. Her mind literally fractured into 17 different points of view, all happening at the same time. I mean, can you even imagine feeling 17 different bodies, 17 sets of senses, all screaming different things at you? It was a complete sensory and existential meltdown. But for Mira, the experience was the polar opposite, and just as horrifying. For almost 200 years, she'd been this perfectly coordinated group of 17. The inversion didn't add more voices, it just silenced 16 of them. It left behind this crushing, unbearable loneliness. She went from being this beautiful symphony to just a single, lonely note.
Now, here's where it gets really crazy. This shock wasn't just happening to a few people like Sarah and Mira. No, their experience was just a tiny drop in the ocean of a cataclysm that instantly rippled across the entire globe, shaking the absolute foundations of society.
Just try to picture this. You have these huge, unified minds, like one single consciousness living in 89 million bodies. And in an instant, they shatter. Suddenly, you have 89 million terrified, isolated people who have never, ever known what it's like to be alone. At the exact same time, millions of people who had chosen a fragmented existence were suddenly forced together, unwillingly fused into a single collective they'd spent their lives trying to avoid. And the inversions had this poetic, almost cruel specificity to them. There were people called the silent ones who had spent decades cultivating a consciousness without words, and suddenly they were flooded with language they couldn't control. And on the flip side, lifelong speakers woke up trapped in total silence, their inner monologue just gone.
And we're not talking about some fringe event here. Look at this number. 47%. That's nearly half of the entire human population, all at once. Billions of people woke up one morning having become the very thing they were not the day before.
So what's the consequence of that? Well, a complete and total system failure. Our whole world is built on some basic assumptions about how a mind works. When you flip half of those minds overnight, everything breaks. Governments that relied on groupthink were suddenly run by individuals who couldn't agree on anything. Economies built for individuals were thrown into chaos by collectives. It all just stopped working.
But while all this practical chaos was unfolding, with society literally falling apart, a much deeper, much more terrifying crisis was taking root. It was a philosophical emergency that hit right at the heart of what it even means to be a person.
And this is the big one, isn't it? This wasn't just a logistical problem, it was a global identity crisis. Was this inversion a mass transformation, where people just changed, or was it a mass death event, where billions of people simply ceased to exist, replaced by brand new people who just happen to have their old memories?
Of course, everyone turned to the philosophers, who were scrambling to make sense of it all. A few positions emerged. One camp took a hard line. Your mental setup is you, so the old you is gone, dead, replaced. Another group argued, no, it's just a change of state. You're still you, just like ice is still water. Then you had others who said as long as you have your memories, you're still you. And of course, some just threw up their hands and said it's like the old ship of Theseus paradox. There's just no objective answer.
But then one thinker, a Dr. Thompson, came forward with this pretty fascinating take. She actually framed this whole catastrophe as an existential gift. Now, a terribly painful one for sure, but a gift that revealed a fundamental truth, that our identity is way more flexible and resilient than we ever thought. That the real you is the thing that continues on, even when the container it lives in gets completely shattered and rebuilt.
But, people couldn't really wait for philosophers to sort this all out. Out there, in the middle of the chaos, people had to figure out how to live. And pretty quickly, 4 main strategies for survival began to emerge.
It really all boiled down to 4 choices. First, you could just embrace it, lean into the new reality. Second, you could fight it, desperately trying to hold on to the person you used to be. A third way was to oscillate, to learn how to switch back and forth. And finally, the toughest path of all, to integrate and somehow be a fusion of both your old and new self.
And if you look at how the population split, it tells a really powerful story. There was no single right answer. Most people landed in one of 2 camps. They either fully embraced the change or they fought it tooth and nail. A lot of people just couldn't cope at all. And look at that tiny little sliver for the integrators. Almost no one could actually pull that off.
So let's go back to Sarah. She is a perfect example of an embracer. After that initial shock wore off, she, or I guess they, started to find new strengths in their new state. Being 17 minds at once meant they could process information incredibly fast, learn new things, and see the world in a way singular Sarah never could have. And actually became a form of growth.
And then you have the fighters, like Mira. For her, giving in and accepting her new singular self felt like letting her true self die. So she chose to live in a state of constant, exhausting performance, faking her old plural self inside her one mind just to keep that original identity from being erased. I mean, can you imagine how tiring that must have been?
So, years went by. The world didn't just snap back to the way it was before. The chaos eventually calmed down, but what was left was a new normal. A world that was forever changed by that single moment of inversion.
And this new normal was just a world of strange new inversions. Relationships that had been solid for decades fell apart overnight. Artists would look at their own masterpieces and feel like a stranger had made them. But maybe the most profound change wasn't about what was lost, it was about what came next, with the children who were born into this new fractured world.
And this right here is really the key takeaway from the whole thing. The kids born after the inversion, they grew up seeing consciousness not as something fixed, but as something fluid. For them, the idea of your mind fundamentally changing wasn't some terrifying event, it was just a part of life. They had a kind of resilience their parents never did, because they understood that their core identity, their me-ness, was something deeper than any one way of being.
Which really just leaves us with one final thought experiment for you. If your entire reality was flipped upside down overnight, what would you do? Would you spend the rest of your life fighting to get back the person you lost, or would you try to embrace the completely new person you'd just become?